Welcome back, fellow traveler. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm. Today, we travel to Spain. But our story begins long before Spain had a name, before its kingdoms, its languages, or its written history. We begin on a cold hillside in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, where someone is crouching at the entrance of a cave, watching a fire fade into embers beneath a sky filled with stars. That person marks the beginning of our journey. Not because we know their name, we do not. Not because they founded a city or ruled a kingdom. They did neither. They matter because they were human, the same species as us, moved by curiosity, memory, fear, companionship, beauty, and the need to make sense of a vast and mysterious world. Let us begin. The painters of Altamira, firelight, bison, and the first art. We are in the far north of the Iberian Peninsula. The Cantabrian mountains rise abruptly from the sea, green, mist-covered, and ancient. Their slopes are thick with oak and beech. Cold rivers run through the valleys toward the Bay of Biscay. Human beings have used this landscape for tens of thousands of years. At Altamira, they entered the same cave again and again across an astonishing span of time. Paintings and engravings were created there between roughly 36,000 and 13,000 years ago. Some marks are older than entire civilizations would later become. The famous polychrome animals on the ceiling belong mainly to the later part of that long story. So let us enter the cave around 15,000 years ago. The last ice age has not yet ended. The world is colder than the one we know. Herds of wild horses, red deer, and bison move through the open country. The people living here know these animals intimately, how they stand, how they run, how their shoulders shift beneath their hides, how they turn their heads when they sense danger. Above what will one day become the small town of Santillana del Mar, there is a cave. Inside it, someone is lying beneath a low ceiling. They work by the light of a small stone lamp, a shallow vessel filled with animal fat, its flame fed by a twisted wick. The light is weak and unsteady. It trembles across the limestone just above the artist's face. In one hand is a piece of red ochre. Nearby are charcoal and other pigments. The artist is creating a bison, not a crude symbol, not a hurried outline, a living animal. Its shoulders are heavy and powerful. Its legs fold beneath its body as though it is resting. Its eye is alert. The artist uses a natural swelling in the limestone to suggest the bison's hump, turning the uneven surface of the cave into part of the animal itself. When the lamp flame flickers, the painted body seems to move. It almost seems to breathe. Around it, over many generations, other figures appear. More bison, standing, resting, turning, gathering in groups, horses, deer, a wild boar, hands and signs whose meanings have been lost. The cave becomes a layered memory, one image beside another, one generation answering another across thousands of years. The artists knew the animals because their lives depended upon that knowledge. They watched them from childhood. They followed their tracks, studied their movements, feared their strength, and understood their habits with a closeness that is difficult for us to imagine. In 1879, Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola, a local landowner and amateur archaeologist, explored the cave with his young daughter Maria. According to the story that has been repeated ever since, it was Maria who looked upward first. "Look, Papa," she said, "oxen." What she had seen was extraordinary. But when Sautuola presented the paintings to the scientific world, many experts refused to believe they were genuine. The images were too skillful, too expressive, too unmistakably human. Surely, they argued, people of the Stone Age could not have created art of such beauty. The paintings were denounced as forgeries, Sautuola died before the scientific establishment finally admitted its mistake. Maria lived long enough to see the paintings accepted as authentic. The art was real. The people who made it were real. And in every way that matters, they were people like us. Altamira is sometimes called the Sistine Chapel of prehistory. The comparison is imperfect, but it captures something important. More than 15,000 years before Michelangelo worked high above the floor of a Roman chapel, anonymous artists were already creating a monumental ceiling in northern Iberia. They worked overhead, in difficult conditions, by artificial light. They understood shape, movement, proportion, color, and the possibilities hidden inside an uneven surface. Pause for a moment with that image. The cave, the lamp, the smell of smoke, animal fat, and damp limestone, a hand moving slowly across the rock, and an animal, a creature of muscle, breath, and memory, appearing one careful line at a time. Some things have always mattered to human beings. Beauty is one of them. Across the millennia that followed, the peoples of the Iberian Peninsula continued to change. The ice retreated, forests spread, coastlines shifted. Many of the great animals of the Pleistocene disappeared. Rivers filled with fish, and human communities adapted to a warmer world. Agriculture arrived gradually from the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, carried westward through generations of movement, exchange, and imitation. People planted grain, they raised sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. They remained in one place long enough to build permanent settlements, and they began to build monuments. Along the Atlantic regions of what are now Portugal and western Spain, communities raised great stones from the earth. We call them megaliths, from the Greek words for large stone. There were solitary menhirs standing against the sky, stone circles. Passage graves and dolmens built from enormous slabs, sometimes covered with earth to form long mounds. Within these chambers, the dead were placed with care. Beside them were pottery vessels, tools, ornaments, and bones colored with red ochre. We do not know exactly what these communities believed. We do not know the words they used for the sky, the dead, the ancestors, or whatever they imagined beyond the limits of ordinary life. But we know that they buried their people deliberately, with ceremony, with remembrance, with something that looks very much like love. The dolmen of Menga, near Antequera in Andalusia, was constructed between approximately 3,800 and 3,600 BCE. It is older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Its builders moved and raised 32 enormous stones with a combined weight of more than 1,000 tons. The largest roof stone weighs around 150 tons, roughly the mass of a blue whale. They did this without metal tools, without written plans, and without the machines we would consider essential. Yet the monument was not improvised. Its stones were carefully selected, transported, shaped, angled, fitted together, and supported with a remarkable understanding of weight and pressure. It still stands. Today, you can walk inside it and enter a chamber that human beings have regarded as meaningful for almost 6,000 years. Stone remembers, even when almost everything else has been forgotten. Traders from across the sea, Phoenicians, Greeks, and the birth of Cádiz. Let us move forward now. Not to the end. There is still a long road ahead of us, but forward by several thousand years. The ancient stone chambers have already stood for generations beyond counting. Bronze is being worked in the river valleys of Iberia, into tools, weapons, vessels, and jewelry of surprising delicacy. And across the Mediterranean, something remarkable is happening. A people of sailors and merchants have learned to read the winds, currents, and stars well enough to navigate open water at night. They come from the eastern Mediterranean, from the narrow coastal lands of what is now Lebanon and its surroundings. The Greeks called them Phoenicians, a name associated with the rare purple dye they traded. The dye was produced from sea snails and required so much labor that it became one of the most valuable colors in the ancient world, worn by kings, priests, and the powerful. The Phoenicians became the greatest long-distance merchants of their age. They established trading settlements across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. Eventually, their ships passed through the narrow strait where Europe and Africa nearly touch and entered the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side, they encountered a coast rich in resources: silver, copper, lead, and access to tin, essential for producing bronze. The local peoples were already mining, smelting, farming, and trading among themselves. Now new goods, techniques, stories, and languages began to arrive by sea. Sometime in the early first millennium BCE, traditionally around 1100 BCE, though modern archaeology suggests the first Phoenician settlement may have been somewhat later, the newcomers founded a trading post on an island near the southern Atlantic coast of Iberia. They called it Cádiz. They built a sanctuary dedicated to Melkart, a god associated with kingship, travel, the sea, and distant horizons. For the Phoenicians, this was close to the edge of the familiar world. Today, the ancient island has become part of a larger urban landscape joined to the mainland. The city is called Cádiz. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. For around 3,000 years, people have awakened there, walked through its streets, fished in its waters, traded in its harbour, and looked toward the same Atlantic horizon. Stand today in the old city of Cádiz, among white walls, narrow streets, sea wind, and the smell of salt and fresh fish, and you are standing in a place shaped by layer after layer of human life. The Phoenicians are gone, so are the Carthaginians and Romans who followed them, the Visigoths, the Muslims of Al-Andalus, and the generations of Spanish sailors who later used Cádiz as a gateway to the Atlantic world. But the city remains, still inhabited, still facing the sea. There is something quietly astonishing in that kind of continuity. Greek merchants also established settlements and trading relationships along the Mediterranean coast of Iberia. They brought pottery, wine, olive oil, artistic styles, religious ideas, and their own ways of describing the world. They came to call the peninsula Iberia, perhaps after the river they knew as the Iber, the Ebro. The name endured. Then came the Carthaginians from the great North African city of Carthage, itself founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers, but now a powerful state in its own right. The Carthaginians saw Iberia as more than a place of trade. They saw territory, mineral wealth, soldiers, and a strategic base from which to challenge Rome for control of the Western Mediterranean. Their general Hamilcar Barca arrived with an army and a plan to build Carthaginian power in Iberia. He brought his young son with him. The boy was perhaps 9 years old. He had begged to accompany the expedition. In Iberia, he would learn the landscape, the roads, the rivers, the mountains, and the habits of armies. Years later, he would lead troops out of Iberia, cross the Alps with war elephants, and bring Rome closer to destruction than almost any enemy before or after him. His name was Hannibal Barca. The peoples of Iberia, proud, fierce, and deeply rooted. We have spoken about the visitors, Phoenicians, Greeks, and Carthaginians. But what of the people who were already here? During the first millennium BCE, the Iberian Peninsula was home to a remarkable variety of cultures. Along the Mediterranean coast and through the river valleys of the south and east lived peoples whom historians call the Iberians. They were not a single unified nation. They lived in different communities, spoke related but distinct languages, and organized themselves through local cities, territories, and ruling elites. They built fortified settlements on hills. They farmed grain, olives, and grapes. They worked iron and silver. They minted coins, traded widely, and used writing systems that scholars can partly read, though the language behind them remains imperfectly understood. Their sculptors created extraordinary works. The most famous is the Lady of Elche, a limestone bust discovered in southeastern Spain and dated to around the 5th or 4th century BCE. She faces us with extraordinary stillness. Her headdress is elaborate. Large circular ornaments frame her face. Her expression is calm, dignified, and slightly distant, as though she has heard every question we could ask and has chosen not to answer. No one knows with certainty who she represents. A goddess, a priestess, a noblewoman, a funerary image. After more than 2,000 years, she keeps her secret. The Lady of Elche was once painted. The colours have mostly faded, but traces remain. Her stone face and clothing were originally alive with pigment. The ancient world, which we often imagine as white marble beneath museum lights, was far more colourful than that. Statues were painted, temples were painted. Architectural details glowed in red, blue, yellow, black, and gold. Antiquity was vivid. Time has simply washed much of its colour away. In the north, west, and interior lived many other peoples, including communities we describe as Celtic and Celtiberian. Their cultures were shaped by local traditions and by influences connected to the wider Celtic world of Western and Central Europe. In Galicia and northern Portugal, people built circular stone settlements known as castros on defensible hills and ridges. Many can still be visited today, their dry stone walls standing against Atlantic wind and rain. They raised cattle and pigs, cultivated grain, brewed fermented drinks, worked metal, and defended their communities fiercely. Celtiberian warriors became known for their endurance, their swords, and their knowledge of difficult terrain. Every empire that attempted to conquer the peninsula would discover the same truth. Iberia could be entered, it could be invaded, but it would not be easily subdued. Rome arrives, roads, aqueducts, and a new civilization. Rome entered Iberia in 218 BCE because of the Second Punic War, the enormous struggle between Rome and Carthage. Hannibal had marched out of Iberia, crossed the Alps, and invaded Italy. Rome responded by attacking Carthage's base in the peninsula. By 206 BCE, Carthaginian power in Iberia had been broken. Rome now found itself in possession of a land rich in metals, farmland, ports, and people. It decided to stay, but conquering the peninsula would take nearly 2 centuries. The peoples of Iberia had no intention of surrendering quietly. In the west, the Lusitanians fought a long resistance against Roman expansion under a remarkable leader named Viriathus. Tradition remembered him as a shepherd who became a brilliant commander. He used speed, surprise, and an intimate knowledge of the landscape to frustrate larger Roman armies. Again and again, he disappeared into the hills before Rome could trap him. The Romans eventually defeated him not in open battle, but through betrayal. Men from his own side murdered him while he slept, hoping for a reward. According to the later story, the Romans refused to pay them, declaring that Rome did not reward traitors. Whether every detail happened exactly that way is uncertain. But the memory of Viriathus endured, especially in Portugal and western Spain, as a symbol of resistance to foreign rule. And then there was Numantia, a Celtiberian stronghold on a high plateau in the interior of the peninsula. It was not a vast city. Perhaps only several thousand people lived there. But when Rome surrounded it in 134 BCE, sending Scipio Aemilianus and a huge army, Numantia resisted for months. The Romans built camps, walls, towers, and barriers around the settlement, sealing it off from the outside world. Numantia did not fall to a direct assault. It starved. When the end came, Many of the survivors chose death rather than enslavement. The city was destroyed. Yet Roman writers remembered it. The courage of the defeated had unsettled the victors. There is something about people who refuse to surrender that commands respect, even from those who overcome them. Across later centuries, Numantia became a symbol of Spanish resistance and national character. Its story returned in poems, histories, political speeches, and plays. Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, wrote a tragedy called The Siege of Numantia. Long after the city itself had vanished, its final decision continued to echo. Once Roman control was fully established, something extraordinary followed. Iberia did not remain merely a distant conquered province. It became one of the most thoroughly Romanized regions of the empire. Roads crossed the peninsula, connecting ports, mines, farms, military posts, and cities. Many modern roads still follow routes first established in Roman times. New cities rose with forums, temples, theatres, amphitheatres, markets, and public baths. Roman law shaped property, commerce, citizenship, and government, and Roman engineers transformed the movement of water. The Aqueduct of Segovia is one of the greatest surviving examples. Built around the early 2nd century CE, it carried fresh water from the mountains across a system extending roughly 15 to 16 kilometers toward the city. Its most famous section rises on 2 levels of arches, 167 arches in total, reaching almost 29 meters at its highest point. It was assembled from around 24,000 granite blocks. There is no mortar holding them together, only weight, pressure, precise cutting, and an extraordinary understanding of how stone behaves. After nearly 2,000 years, it still appears almost impossibly complete. The aqueduct continued bringing water into Segovia until the final third of the 20th century. The engineers who designed it remain unknown. No surviving inscription preserves their names. They built something that outlived the empire that commissioned it by more than 15 centuries. It remained useful in an age of electricity, automobiles, aircraft, and space travel. And they left no signatures behind. Some legacies do not need one. Imagine the aqueduct at dawn. Grey granite catching the first light. Arches moving across the city like a procession frozen in stone. Birds nesting in the openings. Segovia still quiet beneath them. For most of its long life, water moved silently through the channel above. Stone, water, and time working together. The Romans also transformed the land. Across Andalusia and the Mediterranean coast, they expanded estates and farms. Olive trees marched in long rows across the hills, their silver-green leaves catching the sun. Vineyards spread along warm slopes. Wheat grew across the great central plateau. Hispanian olive oil, wine, grain, metals, and fish products travelled throughout the empire. And Rome gave Iberia Latin. Not the formal Latin carved into monuments, but the everyday Latin spoken by soldiers, merchants, farmers, officials, craftspeople, and families. Over centuries, that spoken language changed. It softened, divided, absorbed older local words, and developed differently from one region to another. From it would eventually grow Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, Galician, and other Romance languages of the peninsula. Every time someone says Buenas noches, they are speaking words connected by an unbroken line to the Latin heard in Iberian streets 2,000 years ago. Nox, noche, the same ancient root carried forward through generations of ordinary speech. Hispania gives Rome some of its greatest minds. We often think of Rome as the giver. Rome gave its provinces roads, law, cities, language, engineering, and administration. And it did. But the provinces also gave something back. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Hispania gave Rome some of its greatest writers, teachers, philosophers and rulers. Lucius Annius Seneca was born in Cordoba around 4 BCE. He became one of the most influential thinkers of the Roman world, a philosopher of ethics, self-command, mortality, anger, grief, wealth, power, and the difficult art of living well. His letters and essays still speak with surprising directness across 20 centuries. Quintilian, one of Rome's greatest teachers of rhetoric and education, came from Caliguris, modern Calahorra in La Rioja. The poet Martial, whose sharp comic epigrams give us one of the liveliest portraits of everyday Roman life, was born near modern Calatayud in Aragon. And then there were the emperors. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, and under whom the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, was born in Italica, near modern Seville. He was the first Roman emperor born outside Italy. His successor, Hadrian, belonged to another family long established in Italica. Ancient sources disagree over whether Hadrian himself was born there or in Rome, but his roots in Hispania were deep. His mother came from Cádiz, ancient Cádiz, and his family had been connected to Italica for generations. Hadrian travelled constantly, reorganized the empire's frontiers, commissioned monumental building projects, rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, and gave his name to the wall that still crosses northern Britain. Two emperors, shaped by the same small corner of Andalusia, went on to rule a world stretching from Britain to the deserts of the Middle East. The ruins of Italica remain a short distance from Seville. You can walk across the mosaic floors of Roman houses. You can follow streets once lined with columns and shops. You can sit inside its enormous amphitheatre, one of the largest in the Roman world, and look out toward the Andalusian countryside. It is difficult not to imagine the distance between that quiet landscape and the vast empire governed by men whose families began there. Hadrian spent much of his reign travelling through Britain, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and the eastern frontiers. He seemed unable to remain in one place for long. Perhaps the restlessness of a traveller sometimes begins in a place that feels too small for the imagination. Hispania was not merely a province at the edge of Rome's world. It was one of that world's beating hearts. The Visigoths and the long twilight of the Roman world. Everything passes, even Rome. During the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries CE, the Roman world changed profoundly. Political instability weakened imperial authority. Economic pressures grew. Armies proclaimed and removed emperors. Peoples moved across frontiers in large migrations, sometimes as refugees, sometimes as allies, and sometimes as conquerors. Christianity spread throughout the empire, changing not only religious practice, but the entire texture of culture, law, art, education, and thought. Roman rule in the western provinces gradually fractured. The Visigoths were not simply wild destroyers arriving from beyond civilization. They had lived near and within the Roman world for generations. Many had served in Roman armies. Their leaders understood Roman law, administration, military organization, and diplomacy. They had adopted Christianity, though at first in a form different from that followed by most Hispano-Roman Christians. When Visigothic power expanded into Iberia during the 5th century, they did not erase everything Rome had built. They settled into its remains. They governed through many Roman institutions. Their kings issued legal codes in Latin. Hispano-Roman landowners, bishops, administrators, and educated elites continued to play central roles in society. For roughly 2 centuries, Visigothic Hispania existed in a long twilight, no longer fully Roman, but not yet the medieval Spain that would follow. Roman roads, bridges, and aqueducts slowly deteriorated without the centralized system that had maintained them. But the cities remained. The churches remained. The language remained. And memories of Rome remained, embedded in stone, law, worship, and the evolving Latin speech of ordinary people. Visigothic kings and craftspeople produced objects of extraordinary beauty. Goldsmiths worked with gold, garnet, pearls, glass, and precious stones, creating crosses, brooches, altarpieces, and royal offerings of astonishing delicacy. The treasure of Guarazar, discovered near Toledo in the 19th century, contains magnificent votive crowns made to hang above church altars. They are fashioned from gold and jewels, with letters suspended beneath them to spell the names of kings. Several surviving pieces are preserved in Madrid. Imagine them in their original setting, hanging above a candlelit altar in the Visigothic capital, moving slightly in the rising warmth, gold and garnet catching the flame. The world that made them was not uncultured. It was fragile, divided, and deeply troubled, but capable of great beauty. The Visigothic kingdom suffered from a persistent weakness. Its royal succession was unstable. Kings were elected, challenged, deposed, assassinated, or replaced. Powerful families competed for the throne, and political disputes repeatedly became violent. By the beginning of the 8th century, the kingdom was divided by rival claims and years of internal conflict. Across the strait, in North Africa, Muslim armies had expanded westward under the Umayyad Caliphate. They had heard of the kingdom's divisions, and they were watching. A crossing at dawn, the arrival that changed everything. It is the spring of 711 CE. The sky is beginning to brighten above the strait. At its narrowest point, only about 14 kilometers of water separate Europe from Africa. On a clear day, one continent can be seen from the other. The Rock of Gibraltar rises on the European side, a vast limestone mass catching the first light before much of the surrounding coast. And in the half-darkness, boats are crossing. They carry an expeditionary force of around 7,000 men, most of them Berbers from North Africa and Muslims by faith, commanded by a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad. They cross under the authority of the Umayyad governor of North Africa. Tariq's forces land near the Great Rock and establish a position there. The mountain becomes associated with his name, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. Over centuries, as languages shifted and sounds changed, Jabal Tariq became Gibraltar. The Visigothic king Roderick gathered an army and marched south. The two forces met in a battle whose exact location remains debated, probably somewhere in southern Iberia near the Guadalete or Barbate region. Roderick was defeated and disappeared from reliable history, perhaps killed during the battle or soon afterward. The political structure of the Visigothic kingdom collapsed with remarkable speed. Cities fell, surrendered, or negotiated agreements with the newcomers. Córdoba was taken. Toledo, the old capital, was occupied soon afterward. Additional Muslim forces crossed from North Africa, and within several years, most of the peninsula had come under Muslim control. The conquest was rapid, but it was not a single simple event. Some communities resisted, others negotiated. Local elites sometimes kept land or authority in exchange for submission and taxation. The new rulers were few compared with the population they governed, and much of everyday life continued beneath a changing political order. In the remote northern mountains, Christian resistance would later gather around a small kingdom in Asturias. At first it was little more than a collection of valleys, settlements, and defensible passes. A refuge, not yet a rival. But its survival would matter enormously in the centuries to come. Before his great battle against the Visigoths, Tariq ibn Ziyad is said to have addressed his soldiers with words remembered across the centuries. Behind them, the sea. Before them, the enemy. No path except forward. Historians debate whether the famous speech survives in anything like its original form. The accounts were written down long after the events, and legend gathered around Tariq's campaign almost immediately. But the image endured. A commander standing between a sea crossing and an unknown future, asking thousands of men to take one more step forward. History is filled with moments like this, vast consequences balanced upon decisions made by human beings on a single morning. What came next for the Iberian Peninsula, and for Europe, science, philosophy, architecture, agriculture, language, and the history of knowledge, would be extraordinary. The world of Al-Andalus was about to begin, but that deserves a journey of its own. We began in a cave where human beings created art across more than 20,000 years, beneath the trembling light of small lamps. We watched Phoenician ships arrive from the eastern Mediterranean and saw Cádiz, the city that would become Cádiz, take its first breaths beside the Atlantic. We stood on a shore where merchants spoke in many languages and watched a young Hannibal grow toward the campaign that would terrify Rome. We met the peoples of Iberia, artists, farmers, metalworkers, traders, and warriors whose cultures were older and more complex than the conquerors often understood. We followed Roman roads, stood beneath Roman arches, and listened for water moving through the Aqueduct of Segovia. We met a philosopher from Cordoba, writers from the interior, an emperor born in Italica, and another whose family roots reached deep into the same Andalusian soil. We watched Visigothic goldsmiths working by candlelight in Toledo, and from a hillside in the pale darkness before sunrise, we saw boats cross a narrow strait in the spring of 711. How much has happened upon this land? How many layers remain in its stones, its roads, its place names, its art, and the languages spoken there each morning when people awaken? For now, our journey ends here. In the next chapter, part 2 of this trilogy, medieval Spain. Moorish palaces, contested frontiers, sacred wars, and a golden age of learning, from the first generations of Muslim rule in Cordoba to the cold January morning when the last Sultan of Granada surrendered the keys of the Alhambra. Until then, fellow traveler,